Hey guys, so I recently brought a meta tier list by the data post Power of the Elements, so as usual, time to bring another tier list focusing only on rogue decks. As usual, a big thanks to my sponsors, links in the description if you're feeling like purchasing some Yu-Gi-Oh supplies. Now, similar to the last meta tier list video, since we didn't have any YCS level events post Power of the Elements, the formula is going to incorporate the top cut representation based on regionals instead, and always feel free to check my original tier list video to learn how the tier scores are actually calculated. So this was the meta tier list that I posted last week, and so basically this current rogue tier list video will not be looking at decks that were in tier 1 or 2. Now, as I mentioned in my last video, YGO can't identify Exorcisters yet, and they're probably tier 2 at the moment, so either way they wouldn't be included for this rogue tier list video. Speaking of YGO limitations, while the site is amazing, there's definitely several decks that this site cannot identify as of yet, and this is especially the case for rogue decks. For example, decks like Marincis, Dynamorphia, Libromancer, and Protoplant can't be identified exactly, but instead are being categorized as other decks, so I can't include them for this video. As for Burning Abyss, you probably know the drill by now, but this usually ends up reflecting Phantom Knights instead. And as for Pure Shaddoll, I can no longer include this in the rogue tier list, at least for now, because tier elements are being incorrectly categorized as Shaddoll on YGO. So those are things to know, and I'm sure there's several other decks that I'm missing that are miscategorized on YGO, so feel free to let me know in the comments if you know more. So let's get right into the tier list, and we are starting off with Ignissur. Now this is a little tricky because I know Ignissur Mathmech is the one that actually topped the recent regional post-POT, and let me know in the comments if most Ignissur players are running with the Mathmech stuff, or if it's still run without them, or maybe it's just a small package. I really don't know much myself. Mathmech was surprisingly categorized as tier 1 in my recent tier list video, so perhaps Ignissur may no longer be considered as rogue if they sorta end up becoming the same thing. Either way, still a cool deck and has had competitive success for a while now. Then we have another deck that might be a little questionable to be in rogue, and that is Drytron. I heard turn skip Drytron is a thing right now. Don't know how common that actually is, but the deck just always is full of gas and pretty scary to stop. Not in its tier 1 glory days anymore, but still a good deck if you have the big brains to pilot it. Next we have tropicate, which may easily come out of this rogue section very soon because I'm now seeing it being mixed with the Sprite engine. Really cool that Kit and Chris happens to be level 2, so you know that they can pull off that Sprite combo, and they did top a regional recently post-POT as well. Then we have Heroes, which actually was the most played rogue deck on Dueling Book in the last 7 days, although its score didn't come first since it didn't have any recent regional tops in the new format, at least not that I'm aware of. Darklaw is actually pretty deadly against tier elements since every card will end up getting banished, not to mention Darklaw rips a card after you add a card as well. I know a small number of tier elements or sprite decks side mask change 2 to go into Darklaw themselves, so that might erroneously contribute to the hero numbers, but likely a negligible amount. Starting off the second tier rogue is Dogmatica Invoke, which is slowly climbing back up in the ranks after being considered a really lower performing rogue deck. I'm surprised that despite the availability of the branded package, it still hasn't really done well at in-person events performance wise, even after a few months of post-alba strike. Alistair is still one of the best normal summons in the game, and being able to fuse using either graveyard is always going to have some utility in every format. Next we surprisingly have Salammancer, which was actually in tier 2 for the last couple of months but dropped a lot for this month. I think it's still a very good deck and in that tier 2 conversation still, although at least on Dueling Book it wasn't doing too well with that 45% match win percentage. Cybers has been getting a lot of good support over the years though, so I'm confident Salad will always be at worst a strong rogue choice. Then as usual we have Mystic Mind Burn, which continues to have over a 50% match win percentage on Dueling Book, likely because it leads to so many people scooping. Honestly, not worth spending over an hour on some internet points to play against this deck, but let's just hope we don't see too much of it at in-person premier level events. All it does is just stall and slowly burn you for game while fixing up your top deck so you don't draw that back removal. Next we have Virtual World, which honestly seems to keep going up and down on my tier list. Not sure what the best way to play Virtual World is at this point, whether pure or with the adventure token engine, or maybe they're also playing with the punk stuff too. Pretty cool synchro based deck that is also sorta dependent on levels, so if more decks start playing Mischief of the Gnomes, or the ban played on because of Sprite, this deck might indirectly get affected as well. Then we have the good old reliable Dinos. Not too much to say about this deck anymore because I pretty much end up saying the same thing. If you play Dinos, let me know what your thoughts are on this format with this deck, especially if you're blinding second against a format of Sprite and tier elements. Next is Phantom Knights, which was also struggling win percentage wise at 43% and just a shell of its former self without Anaconda. Rusty is still a pretty good dang monster though, and I'm sure this deck will be able to come back at some point again given that it's a dark focused deck. Next is one of the most well-known rogue decks for a long time, Altergeist, a trap-focused strategy that basically got overshadowed since the release of Eldritch. It's still hanging on and being played a decent amount on Dueling Book. It's not too floodgate heavy though, considering it's a trap deck and actually has some pretty cool interactions. Speaking of floodgates, a deck that solely relies on such cards is True Draco, which basically will always invoke disgust among opponents if they see you playing this. Although this is probably the cheapest deck on the list since it doesn't play an extra deck, so if you're a new player into the game, this deck will be an easy way to learn the game and play to start off. Dynamite Knight will probably come back to 3 in the next ban list as well, and to be honest, that really won't do anything. Now, a deck that has fallen off hard is DDD, which at one point made it as high as tier 2 on my meta tier list after I topped the YCS. Unfortunately, it looks like that hype has died down in the last couple of months, and it does require Galaxy Brain to pilot, and that 38% match win percentage isn't looking so good. But at the same time, I think the score here is too low for DDD. It's obviously a much better deck than something like True Draco or Altergeist, and I'm sure we'll see another top with this deck soon enough. Another deck that's fallen off really hard lately is ABC. I was really surprised by this considering that ABC Brave Therian just seemed nuts after Dimension 4s, and it's not like we've had a ban list since then, so curious why the big drop off in play with this deck. Its win percentage at 52% in the last 7 days is honestly respectable for a rogue deck, and at one point someone could have argued ABC Brave was a potential tier 1 deck as well. Next we have Mermail, which is sort of like the original Infernoble Knights since they are focused on hand looping. While a rogue strategy, definitely not something I want to go second against because I really don't want to have to deal with losing 2 cards while also losing another card for turn. Hand loop decks are just never fun to play against. Then we have Mech Knights, which if you follow my channel for a long time, you'd know that this deck used to be one of the best rogue decks online all the time. Sadly not the case anymore, and trying to go second in this format is not the best either, considering that Sprite sets up a really consistent board and Tearlament sets up Window with the attack boost, which Mech Knight previously were able to get over Window easily before, but not as easy now. Next we have Maschine Infinitrack, which also had a respectable 50% match win percentage on Dueling Book the last 7 days. Another deck that makes really good use of Therian King Regulus, although it sort of relies on skill drain because from a monster perspective, its end board isn't too amazing. It's able to dig through the deck and draw though, which is nice, and since Stroll isn't too popular this format, maybe that's just great news for this deck. Lastly on this section is Adamancipator, which I guess was the previous meta deck before tier elements that would rely on random excavations to go off in their combos, although was still very consistent. Still a solid rogue strategy with a cool gimmick. They definitely need Block Dragon, but I don't think that card can come back right now. And finally, in the last tier of rogue, we have my beloved Cyber Dragons. That 30% match win percentage is horrendous and worst on this list, and admittedly after the ban of Anaconda, this deck just is not the same. On the plus side, this deck can also do Sprite combo with the regular Cyber Dragon plays, although of course there are much better Sprite variants out there than mixing it with Cyber Dragons. Lastly, we have Blue Eyes, which I'm almost a little offended that it still had a higher win percentage than Cyber Dragons. Another anime fan favorite deck that's typically more so synchro focused, although Blue Eyes Guard Dragon stuff used to be a thing back in the day as well. Definitely haven't topped any relevant events in the last few years, but hopefully we can see it get a top someday and get the classic fans hyped. Alright guys, so that was it for this month's Rogue tier list. Hope you found that helpful in choosing the next Rogue strategy you want to play. As always, a big thanks to my Patreons Eileen Dice Queen, Bold Spider, Cybernetic, Brandon Jaren, Barrelord, Spooky Boogie, and Stephen Phillips as always for supporting the channel. You guys are great. If you're interested in joining my Patreon, links down below. Take care guys.